Some people refer to him as Henry VIII's pet dog. But Thomas Cromwell was much more than that. Realizing that the king faced serious threats from Catholics both at home and abroad, he created a formidable web of informants, spies, and double agents that gathered information across the land, warning him of impending plots and treason. What he started was the foundation of a new secret service.
Cromwell's spy network was vital for knowing what was going on, certainly in this country, but much more important, what was happening in Rome.
Catholics went from being your average person in the street, your neighbour, your friend, your family member, to being really considered to be little short of terrorists.
Cromwell was extraordinarily ruthless. He was certainly driven, he was very ambitious. But this was the arena that he was operating in. You had to be like that, not just to survive, but to thrive in Henry's court.
I think what Thomas Cromwell did and what he did for Henry VIII changed the course of history, possibly world history.
Thomas Cromwell was born in 1485 in southwest London. He spent much of his early life on the continent, initially fighting as a soldier in the French army, later becoming a merchant in Italy. He returned to England around 1512, studied law, and married a wealthy widow. In 1520, in a pivotal career move, he became legal secretary for Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's right-hand man. Wolsey then became Cromwell's mentor and rapidly advanced his career, helping him to become a member of Parliament.
Wolsey and Cromwell were like two peas in a pod. They were both of humble birth. Wolsey was the son of a butcher, and of course Cromwell is the son of a blacksmith. That gave them something very important in common. It was a meeting of minds, and really they conspired very effectively for Cromwell's rise to greatness and also to protect Wolsey's position at court.
Cardinal Wolsey was the right-hand man of the king. Probably, next to the king, the most powerful person in the country. Wolsey had seen the potential of this ambitious young man and given him a job. Cromwell, of course, saw the potential of working for this powerful man and also saw the potential of furthering his career.
Cromwell was definitely Wolsey's protege. He learned a great deal from the cardinal, who was all-powerful. He was the most powerful man in England, next to King Henry VIII himself. So Cromwell, I think, was inspired by Wolsey's example. Here was a low-born man who was now pretty much running the country, and it really did inspire Cromwell for his own rapid rise to power.
Thomas Cromwell was about as ambitious as it gets. He's somebody who is a total workaholic, totally dedicated, totally loyal. And as far as he's concerned, the sky's the limit. He begins as a hooligan in South London with a criminal dad and ends up an earl. That's about as good as it gets in Tudor England.
I think if we look at spy masters, they share several characteristics. They all have to have a certain level of ruthlessness, I think. It's almost the Machiavellian, the ends justify the means. They have to have a certain goal that drives them. But equally, they have to be present and aware of the situations in which they're operating, I think. But certainly the ruthless determination to track down all those who oppose their government has to be key to all of them.
The biggest issue at the time was King Henry's desire to divorce himself from his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the sister of the King of Spain. Henry had long fallen out of love for her, with his affections now focused on a young Anne Boleyn. But Henry had scant grounds for any divorce, not to mention Catherine's popularity with the English people. It was a mess. And the man charged with sorting it out was Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's closest advisor.
There's only one issue of the day during the 1520s, and that is the divorce. Henry VIII is desperate to get rid of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to marry Anne Boleyn. And like the spoilt child he is, he instructs his indulgent parent, Wolsey, to go and get it for him.
The big issue for anybody in England about 1530 is how the king gets rid of his wife and gets to marry the woman he loves and produce a child by her, a son to inherit his throne. And this is practically impossible because the Pope has decided not to award an annulment for the marriage.
Wolsey was a good Catholic, he was a cardinal. He knew that he hadn't got a cat's chance in hell of pulling this divorce off. His problem was he was trying to serve two masters, the King of England and the Pope, and he knew that he'd never manage it. All he could do was try and string it out as long as possible to keep his head. He must have been terrified.
Your Majesty, we have been conferring with the papal envoys for months. But I fear that the Holy Father will never give his assent to your divorcing Queen Catherine so that you may marry the Lady Anne.
Bastards! I will have my divorce and I will marry Anne. You have failed me, Wolsey. I told you what I wanted and you have failed me!
I think Wolsey was in an increasingly impossible position. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place, because he couldn't get the divorce without alienating the Pope, and he had no intention of doing that. But equally, it was no mean feat to go to Henry VIII and tell him that you had failed.
Once it was clear that Wolsey had failed to convince the Pope and his cardinals to grant Henry a divorce, the ambitious and fiercely Protestant Cromwell devised a radical new plan, a plan that he hoped the king would like.
Cromwell's problem was exactly the same as Wolsey's, of course. Without the authority of the Pope, Henry couldn't have a divorce. And so Cromwell's plan B was quite simple and very ingenious. Set up your own church. Remove the Pope and put the king as head of the church. And that's what he did.
Wolsey's told the king that Rome will neither countenance divorce from Catherine nor marriage to Boleyn. None of it.
But what if there was another way?
Tell me more.
What if there was a new church? A Church of England, with Henry at its head?
Break from Rome?
Yes.
Cromwell, by 1533, was one of the most renowned lawyers in the world. So he was going to be good at finding all the legal justifications for a divorce, and that's what he did. But he also consulted the universities of Europe to get more of an ideological and sort of philosophical ground for the divorce. And of course, certain clauses from the Bible were invoked that said, you know, if you marry your brother's wife, then the marriage is cursed, effectively. And they made much of this, even though there was a clause that directly contradicted that further on in the Bible. They ignored that one and they chose to listen to this Leviticus, which said about not marrying your brother's wife.
It's right here. Leviticus 20:21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. And there we have it. It's a great thing we're doing, Cranmer, for king and country.
Breaking with Rome and creating a new Church of England was a hugely radical plan. England, like all of Europe, was a staunchly Catholic nation, with the Pope a direct representative of God. To do away with that and make King Henry the new head of the Church was unthinkable in many circles.
It was such a seismic shift. We were a faithful Roman Catholic country. We had been for centuries. Now suddenly, the king, not the Pope, is head of a new Church of England. And it has been identified as one of those moments in history where you can pinpoint the birth of our national identity.
Your Grace, I've been in discussions with Archbishop Cranmer, and I think we may have found a solution to your problem. This is a proposal for an act of cessation. We break with Rome and form a new Church of England, with you at its head. You would then be free to declare Catherine's marriage illegal, commence annulment proceedings, and free yourself to marry Mistress Anne. And, by God's grace, bring an heir.
The plan that results in the formation of Henry VIII's Church of England is almost nightmarishly radical. It's the first time in history that a reigning sovereign, a king, has not just quarrelled with a pope, but has decided to take over the national church himself and decree the form of Christianity in his realm. It's a tradition of nobles and proletarians and kind of second-rate heretics to jettison Christianity, but for a sovereign lord of a realm to do it really is news.
Basically, Cromwell wanted the whole of England to turn Protestant in a heartbeat, which was great, apart from the fact that what you've got to remember is that in those days, your religion meant everything. And all of a sudden, you've got all these people that are told, by the way, the Pope's no longer the head of the church, the king is, and you've got to obey. People were more frightened of the afterlife, probably, than death. Some just went for it and said, yeah, I accept it, but an awful lot of people didn't.
Cromwell was well rewarded for his services. And with Wolsey gone, he was made the new chief minister to the king. His job was simple: assert Henry's new authority over the people of England and get everyone, clergy, nobility, and commoners alike, to submit to the new religion or die.
Cromwell knew that the break with Rome was not going to be enough to bring in such a seismic shift in England's religious life, because people were very faithful to the Roman Catholic order, and to turn on a sixpence as they were expected to was probably too much to ask. So Cromwell brought in a whole suite of statutes and laws to reinforce the break with Rome, chief of which was the Oath of Supremacy, whereby Henry VIII's subjects all had to swear to recognise Henry, not the Pope, as the head of the church.
They basically make it treason to deny either the legitimacy of the king's new marriage or the legitimacy of the king's control over the church. And those laws, enforced savagely, had the potential to kill an awful lot of people. Within a couple of years, they'd removed the most respected theologian in England, Bishop Fisher, and the most respected humanist scholar, Thomas More.
Not signing the Oath of Supremacy was punishable by death, and Cromwell initially was reluctant to take that to its ultimate conclusion. He tried to persuade, he tried to cajole, particularly Thomas More, because it would have been much more persuasive to all of the adherents of the old faith if More had converted. So Cromwell visited him in his cell in the Tower several times, tried to wear him down, but of course More would not sign, and he was executed for it. The first major casualty of Cromwell's religious reforms.
Incredibly, an original copy of the document that people were being forced to sign, the Oath of Supremacy, drawn up by Thomas Cromwell in 1534, still survives and is held in the vaults of the National Archives in Kew. One of its curators, Nick Barrett, agreed to unravel it and explain its significance.
These would have been compiled as Parliament sat to discuss its business. And so you find a whole range of bits and pieces here relating to the lands of the earls, the sort of things that you'd expect to be discussed. And then hidden in the middle, you get a quite stunning piece of legislation, which in many ways changed the world overnight. This first piece of text is the Act of Supremacy itself, which gives Henry control of the Church of England, establishing him as his own right rather than the Pope. So Rome no longer has a say over the way people in England worship. But the rest of this text is something even more extraordinary. It's the oath of supremacy that people have to swear. They have to now give their allegiance, their bodies and their souls across to the king, rather than to their former master in Rome. This is a major change in the way people would believe. Suddenly, practicing Catholics would be traitors overnight if they didn't swear this oath and conform to Henry's will. This is a major change in the whole fabric of society, contained in these short lines of text. As a historical document for the history of England, this is up there with Magna Carta or Doomsday Book. This frames the terms on which, firstly, the king controlled the church, and secondly, the ways people can worship. This dictates their lives. He's already got their bodies, now he's got their souls. This is fundamental stuff. Of course, this was issued in the king's name, but no one was fooled. Everyone knew who lay behind it. Thomas Cromwell, the king's fixer, turned almost overnight into a hated figure. From this leads the dissolution of the monastery, another one of those pillars of society where the familiar settings of monastic lands, acting often as a place of refuge, of sanctuary, as travel, it's all torn down overnight. Cromwell is the man to blame. It all stems from this document. And in many ways, what should have been the height of his power is the very beginning of his long fall from grace.
In nomine Patris, Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
By single-handedly defying Rome, Henry had stirred up a hornet's nest around the world. Catholics now saw it as their duty to fight the split from their faith, with their anger focused on the king and his new pregnant queen. When you add in Cromwell's heavy-handed enforcement of the new religion, you can appreciate just how turbulent Tudor England had become.
The break with Rome was the beginning of centuries of religious conflict. It literally divided the country in half. Some people were happy to accept the new reforms, many others were not. We were still, we must remember, a Catholic country, but we weren't Roman Catholics. And it's the Roman Catholics who began to be called, in a derogatory way, papists, who went underground. They were driven underground, and they remained so, not just throughout Henry's reign, but for centuries after.
The astonishing thing was that within a very short space of time of Henry's announcement that his subjects were no longer to be Catholics, no longer subject to Rome, Catholics went from being your average person in the street, your neighbour, your friend, your family member, to being really considered to be little short of terrorists. They were plotters, they were conspirators, they were strange, sinister people in the shadows.
Cromwell was determined to establish the Church of England and banish Catholicism. And often his methods were brutal and outraged many of those people that wanted to remain Catholic.
The Pope and his entourage and his followers across Europe absolutely despised what was happening in England. The Pope pretty much sanctioned the execution or the assassination of King Henry himself, and certainly of his evil advisors and the great concubine, as she was known, Anne Boleyn.
In just a few years, Cromwell had replaced Wolsey as the king's right-hand man and chief minister. And he wasted no time using his newfound authority, launching a full frontal assault on Catholics in England. He oversaw the dissolution of more than 800 monasteries, with their huge wealth passing directly into the king's coffers.
Cromwell was inspired by the break with Rome. For him, it was more than just a political necessity. It fed into his own personal piety, his personal belief in the justice of reform, and he wanted to pursue that. And the dissolution of the monasteries, which really got underway in 1535, gave Cromwell the chance to have a thoroughgoing reform of the Roman Catholic institutions in this country. So he sent his commissioners across the country to inspect the monasteries, and what they reported back was exactly what Cromwell wanted to hear. They were corrupt, they were centres of vice and wealth, and it was all being put to bad uses. So it gave Cromwell the justification he needed to get rid of the monasteries.
Open up in the name of the king! Open up! Break it down.
He saw the potential of the money that was there, and he and his commissioners went into the monasteries and removed the gold, the silver, the artwork, and it all went into the king's treasury.
It was violent and horrible. Monks were just chucked out into the streets, and indeed for a while the ordinary people were forbidden to give them alms, to feed them. So basically a lot of the monks just starved. I mean, it was just horrendous. They had done nothing against the king, but suddenly they were the enemy just by existing. The abbot of Glastonbury Abbey was hanged in his own doorway, and basically a lot of the beautiful buildings were destroyed.
It became ever more ruthless, and it did involve, in many cases, the piecemeal destruction, literally brick by brick, of the monasteries. And these beautiful buildings had dominated the English landscape for hundreds of years. So you can imagine the impact that would have had on the local population. I think they mourned the loss of the buildings as well as their charitable functions that undoubtedly they had played. But yes, the dissolution became increasingly violent, and Cromwell's men, his henchmen, if you like, were the subjects of intense hatred across the country.
We've already closed over 500 monasteries, my lord, arrested over 5,000 monks of various orders, and confiscated goods and chattels to the value of £100,000, which has been handed over to the royal treasury.
But the people, Cromwell. What about the people?
The monasteries and abbeys are corrupt. People rejoice.
And how are they taking to the new faith?
Some are proving a little more difficult to persuade, but they'll come round to our way of thinking.
Very well, Cromwell. You may continue.
The more brutally Cromwell clamped down on the monasteries and Catholics, the more enemies he made for himself and the king.
Open the door! In the name of the king, open the door!
To counter this dissent, Cromwell built up a large spy network across Europe. With access to unlimited funding from the king's purse, he was able to recruit hundreds of spies and informants who would alert him of traitors and plots against the throne. It was the beginning of an English secret service.
Cromwell starts to develop his networks because he wants to know what people are saying on the ground. Everything is reported to Cromwell by his agents, who are by this time scattered across the country. He wants to know, even if people say anything derogatory against the king or against Anne Boleyn, it may be a passing remark, it may even be a joke, but it's all reported back to Cromwell.
Henry, through Cromwell and his other advisors, basically had created this wall of enemies, which meant that he, through Cromwell, had absolutely perforce to knuckle down and develop this intensely effective network of spies. Not just in England, although that's very handy, and not just at court, that's very handy too, but across Europe.
Cromwell is referred to as the most hated man in England. He has enemies everywhere, almost inevitably. They want to bring him down. They despise the fact that he has so much power, particularly as he is not of noble birth. And there is a sense of increasing paranoia by Cromwell. Actually, perhaps paranoia isn't the word, because it's justified a lot of the time. And he starts to step up his spy network, not just in this country, but across the world.
Alan Judd is a former English diplomat and intelligence officer who studied Cromwell's network and believes that the key to its success was a chain of spies and agents on the ground, all reporting information directly back to him.
Someone has to have hands-on physical access who can then report it. Now, generally, he wouldn't be able to report it directly to you because he's over in Bruges or Paris or wherever it is, and you're here in London. So there's got to be at least one courier, possibly more, who's got to be able to transmit this information safely. Now, that information may also have to be encoded, or it may be quite lengthy, therefore it's got to be written. So somebody's got to do that. That may be your first spy, that may be your point spy, as it were, but it may not be. He may give it to someone else who is an encoder. So then you've got 2 or 3 people involved. Then the courier has to be absolutely trustworthy, and probably there has to be more than one courier, because they can't come and go very easily between here and Paris without explanations. So it's going to go through several stages. And that's what would constitute a small network.
Cromwell knew how important it was to win the hearts and minds of the people, and was one of the first to employ the use of a printing press to disseminate information on a large scale. There are very few old, hand-operated wooden presses left in the world, but one can still be found in the medieval town of Lewes in England.
The presses are a replica of an 18th century wooden printing press. It's the standard printing press used from about Caxton's time, 1470, right up to 1800, when iron presses took over. This press would be exactly the same as those used in Cromwell's time during the Reformation, before and after that period. And that's pretty well inked up. So now it's ready for the paper. So I'm going to get a sheet of dampened paper. It's handmade paper, so it had to be dampened to take a good impression. And I'm going to get this paper fixed onto the points. Those points hold it in position when it comes down. So I'm going to take the tympan down onto the form now. So the friscuit's down, and take the tympan down, and then I'm going to run it onto the press and take the first pull. So that'll be a proof to see how it's printing. Lift up the tympan. And that's the first impression. And we can see the friscuit's done a good job. There's no ink around the edge of the type area. I'll take that off.
He used it for basically pamphlet wars. He was a brilliant pamphleteer. He would write these pamphlets, by today's standards, quite unsophisticated, but nevertheless just a smear campaign against the Pope personally and Catholics in general, and basically distribute them throughout the country. And then, in those days, very few people could read and write, and the people who could were the people you kind of tended to look up to in the community. So when they read the leaflets out to you, well, it's coming from him, and it's coming from the court through him, it must be true.
The king and Cromwell on his behalf were carrying out a great propaganda exercise because they were trying essentially to nationalise the church.
and turn it into a very English institution, the King's institution, for his own purposes.
Cromwell used this new invention of the printing press with devastating effectiveness in his anti-papal propaganda. And so suddenly there are all these images, such as a very famous one, which actually hung in Hampton Court itself, of the stoning of the Pope by the four evangelists. Cromwell was very fond of that. He made sure that image was reproduced, but also in text form, not least by having the Bible translated into English so that suddenly it was accessible to everyone, and printed and distributed to every single parish church across the country. Cromwell was trying to win hearts and minds, and the printing press was a crucial weapon in his arsenal.
A Bible like this would take weeks and probably months to print that number of pages. Dampened paper, they all have to be hung up to dry. Each sheet has to be hung up to dry. When it's dry, it has to be dampened again and printed on the reverse. So that lengthens the whole process. And you can imagine the sweat, the noise, the industrial process running through all those weeks and months to produce the number of pages necessary to be then sent to binders, and the end product coming up like this. So a huge job, all done by human labor, human sweat. And of course, we mustn't forget the typesetting as well, where each individual letter has to be set in place in the form.
Cromwell's use of the printing press to disseminate anti-Catholic propaganda, essentially, was really the first example of psychological operations. And they've continued to this present day, and I imagine they will continue into the future. In the 1950s, in Hungary, for instance, the CIA dropped a massive amount of propaganda material, used the radio as well to encourage people there to rise up against the Soviet Union. And that has continued in Afghanistan, in Iraq. The government has used leaflets to great effect to encourage people to rise up against the population. And in some ways, when you're in a system where people cannot get ready access to television or the radio or the internet, particularly going back 500 years, then leaflet dropping is one of the simplest mechanisms there is for getting your information out there.
The more powerful that Cromwell became, the more enemies he created. This now included Queen Anne Boleyn. She had never trusted him and believed that he was spreading malicious rumors about her among the court. As their relationship rapidly deteriorated, she called for his execution as a traitor.
Anne lays down the gauntlet. She says to Cromwell she wants to see his head off his shoulders. They are now in open hostility at court. Cromwell sets about destroying her for good. It's no good just getting a divorce this time. He has to get rid of her permanently, and he derives inspiration from Anne's flirtatious behaviour with her male favourites, and starts quietly gathering evidence from her ladies-in-waiting that she is playing the king false. She is committing adultery with not just one, but 5 men, including her own brother. He is assassinating Anne's character. That's the only way he can see to destroy her for good.
And destroy her, he did. Seizing on the rumors that she was sleeping around with members of Henry's inner circle, he went a step further and accused her of improper relations with her own brother. To make the charge stick, Cromwell arrested and tortured George Boleyn until he confessed to the incest. It was bloody, it was brutal, and it carried on until Cromwell got the admission he wanted.
Torture was illegal in Henry VIII's England, but trust me, that did not stop Thomas Cromwell. First stage, you'd be locked in a cell in solitary. A cell like this one, sometimes for months, to contemplate what was going to happen to you next. Cromwell's next form of interrogation was to cajole you, to blackmail you, to threaten your family. If that didn't work, you would then be taken and shown the implements of torture the implements of torture that were going to be used against you. And if that didn't work, your hands would be tied with a rope, you'd be hoisted on a pulley up to the ceiling. Then they would put very heavy weights round your legs and leave you dangling for anything up to 6 hours. One guy, unfortunately, had a rupture, and they put a metal collar around his waist as his intestines burst from his stomach. He never did confess. The next stage, the severe stage of torture. The Scavenger's Daughter, invented by William Skevington, Lieutenant of the Tower of London, no less. You were made to kneel on the floor. This was opened up. You were pushed. Someone knelt on your shoulders and pushed you right down into this contraption, and then it was snapped shut. And this would then be pushed in. You would be left there for hours in agony. You would bleed from your nose, from your eyes, from your ears, and sometimes even your fingertips. This was usually enough to get most people to confess to what Cromwell wanted you to say.
Tell me the name. Oh, sweet mercy!
Having gone through 3 wives already, Henry was now looking for someone who would give him the one thing he craved, a male heir. And Cromwell believed he had the perfect solution. A German princess called Anne of Cleves. She was young, rich, and Protestant, and he eagerly talked her up to the king.
Henry VIII is not going to agree to marry anyone who he hasn't seen, so no matter what he hears of Anne of Cleves and her various virtues, he says, no, I want to see her. I want her photograph, if you like, the equivalent of. It's sort of like internet dating of the 16th century. So he dispatches the most famous portrait painter of them all, Hans Holbein, to Flanders to paint Anne of Cleves. Now, Holbein, I think, has been briefed by Cromwell because the portrait he sends back is rather flattering of Anne. Henry is delighted, immediately agrees to the wedding, and the contract is signed.
There was Cromwell buttering up the king, saying, look, we've got her portrait. Isn't she beautiful? And there she is, looking in this miniature, looking straight out at the viewer with this extraordinary, serene, beautiful skin, beautiful face, painted by Holbein, just superb. Unfortunately, when Anne of Cleves turned up to marry the king, well, let's put it this way, the portrait had lied.
If you can just imagine the scene when Henry first met Anne of Cleves. She was veiled. He'd seen the painting by Holbein, which was all right. And then the veil comes up, and Henry sees this. I cannot imagine what he must have thought. But of course, his thoughts must have gone straight to the man that organised the wedding in the first place, Thomas Cromwell.
He takes Cromwell roughly to one side and shouts, I like her not. Get me out of it, effectively. Cromwell's instructions once more are to get Henry a divorce.
The Anne of Cleves affair was exactly the ammunition Cromwell's enemies needed to take him down. And playing him at his own game, they laid trumped-up charges of heresy and treason upon him. Henry was forced to make a difficult decision. Cromwell had served him loyally and effectively in the past, but the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, combined with the intense dislike of him at court and in the country, had seriously weakened his position, and his enemies smelled blood.
They start a whispering campaign at court that Cromwell is aiming at nothing less than being king. He wants to usurp Henry. He plans to marry Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, to legitimize himself. And Henry, increasingly paranoid, foul-tempered, eventually decides that he's going to believe them, that he will have Cromwell arrested for treason, and that's exactly what happens on the 10th of June, 1540. Cromwell is arrested without ceremony and thrown into the Tower of London.
The actual charges against Thomas Cromwell lie in the fact that he is thwarting the king's will, particularly in religion, by promoting heresy. So it could be that he was promoting a more radical kind of religion the king wants, and people began to notice this and convince the king. But it seems virtually certain the king would never have listened to these charges had he been happy with the new wife that Cromwell had brought him, and Cromwell's conduct of affairs in general.
In the end, Cromwell wrote a passionate letter to the king asking for clemency. But it fell on deaf ears.
Prostrate at your majesty's feet, I have heard your pleasure that I should write concerning my miserable state. And where I have been accused of treason, I have never in all my life thought to displeasure your majesty, and ask your mercy where I have offended, that I have committed my soul to God and my body and my goods to your majesty. I write this with quaking hands and most sorrowful heart, your most humble and sorrowful servant and prisoner, this Saturday at your tower, Thomas Cromwell.
But his entreaties to the king went unanswered, and Thomas Cromwell was convicted of treason and beheaded in July 1540. Like his mentor, Cardinal Wolsey, Cromwell had been able to ascend to the highest position in government, only to fall as rapidly as he had risen. England's first great spy master had been toppled, but his legacy was a first-class network of spies, agents, and informants that became the basis for a powerful new secret service.
Thomas Cromwell's spy network gave him the eyes and ears across the country. It spread right across Europe. It was vast, and it was unsurpassable.
Cromwell was pretty much a one-off. Henry VIII's court was filled with noblemen, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk. You were born to greatness at Henry's court. And here was Cromwell. He was just the son of a blacksmith. He was a nobody. And suddenly, he takes the world by storm.
Cromwell was absolutely indispensable to Henry VIII. It's very difficult to imagine English history to have taken its course without him.